In the year of our Lord 2020, my wife and I welcomed our third child into the world, a beautiful baby girl to balance out our two older boys. Coincidentally, as you may recall, that same year, the human population on Earth was struck by a global pandemic that would claim millions of lives, change billions more, and threaten the foundations of our health support systems around the globe. Which is to say, I, like many of you, had the pleasure of dealing with the US healthcare system, a system so intricate and convoluted that barely anyone actually knows how much they pay for it, or how it really works. And when I say it works, that's with a huge grain of salt. The US healthcare system is a spider web of interconnected policies, products, companies, all clawing for their piece of the pie. So today, I'm going to do my best to answer two simple questions. Why is US healthcare so expensive? And what can we do to improve it? Welcome to Trav Talks. This video is going to be as long as it needs to be, which is to say, long. If you don't feel like sticking around for the whole thing, I will have links below to shorts that you can digest some of the main content within 60-second bites. Chapter 2, A Personal Story. First, let me start with a personal story from our childbirth experience. All three of our children have been delivered via C-section, and my wife's OB tells her that she was meant to have babies in the 21st century, which is to say, that I'm very grateful for the advanced medicine and surgery practices that we have in American hospitals today. Also, we have very good insurance, coupled with a health savings account, or HSA, so by all accounts, we're doing everything right. Even so, 2 months after we took our baby girl home, I decided to go through the billing and make sure that everything had been accounted for appropriately. As usual, I started to build a spreadsheet. I logged into my HSA account to track any transactions that we had paid a provider directly for. That's our default method of paying for anything medical related. After that, I logged into my insurance provider site to see which bills they had seen and how much they had paid compared to me. It was mostly me because I hadn't met my deductible yet for the year since my benefit year had just begun. For those outside the land of the free, a deductible is an amount that you have to pay for your healthcare before your insurance kicks in and provides any actual coverage. And yes, this is on top of the premiums that you already pay. More on that later. The next step was to see if the amount that my insurance had forwarded to me matched the amount that I should pay for my deductible. If I had paid more than my deductible amount, somebody owed me a refund. I wouldn't be sure who, but we'd cross that bridge when it came to it. Thankfully, I came out with $6,820 that my insurance company had billed me against a $6,850 family annual deductible. This was actually $30 to my benefit, so don't tell my insurance company. After that, I needed to stack up my HSA expenses against my deductible expenses and make sure I hadn't paid out of pocket for anything that should have been covered post-deductible. And trouble. It turned out that on my HSA, I had spent $8,500 since my benefit year started, which meant that I had overpaid $1,700 to somewhere. Here's where it got really fun. Let's start keeping track of how many different places I interact with on my wild journey through the health insurance system here. Here's me with my usual healthy glow. Let's start with my HSA and my insurance company that we've already talked about. Then there were 5 different providers involved in this process: a children's hospital, a clinic, a lab specialist, an adult hospital, and pediatric. Insurance also paid part of the cost to each of these. Naturally, I started with the bills of highest value. Luckily, the 3 highest expenses, accounting for 87% of the total overpayment, were at the same place. As it turns out, not only are each of these providers unique, they each have their own separate billing companies, or at least separate billing departments. So not a single place I called would talk to me about my bills directly, and instead either forwarded me or provided me the number to their billing service. That brings our total parties involved to 12, the 7 we were currently at, plus 5 additional billing providers. At the biggest expense place, I called and explained my situation to the customer service rep, expecting a huge fight. Nope. After I showed my research and lined up which expenses I had paid and which I believed I had overpaid for, she said, "Yep, we shouldn't have billed you that $1,224.78. We'll get a refund started immediately."
Happy birthday!
As pleased as I was to get north of 70% of my overpayment back from a single source, I was pretty shocked by how readily they admitted their mistake. For most people, $1,200 is a good chunk of money. and they had completely casually overcharged me for it. At any rate, I was 73% back to whole. I had spent about 3 hours on research, calling, and running an Excel spreadsheet, and $1,200 for 3 hours worth of work, $400 an hour. I love it when these things work out. Unfortunately, my luck ran out there. After a few more hours on the phone with the 4 other providers and their 4 separate billing departments, I had no more admissions of overpayment. They all kind of looked at each other and said, well, maybe you overpaid there. It was clear that I wasn't going to get anywhere fast. I gave up. In aggregate, the healthcare system took about $450 out of my pocket that I know I should not have paid. But I took my win, I took my lumps, and I decided to be done with it. Now, you might say, that's just one unlucky story. Yeah. Counterpoint. What are the odds that my one interaction in the last 3 years with the healthcare system got me overcharged by $1,700? And even me, with all of my weird fascination with Microsoft Excel, was only able to claw back $1,200 of that. But even if this is an exception, the sheer complexity of the system that I had to interact with on its own is a huge driver of increased costs for everybody, whether you're overcharged or not. So let's move away from my story and get into the bigger picture. Chapter 3. So, is it really that bad? Some of you may not need convincing that the US is unique among our economic peers in terms of our healthcare distribution approach. You may be well aware of the fact that we are in fact a laughingstock when it comes to other rich countries and how we distribute and pay for our healthcare. But I don't want to leave any doubt here. I want to show you that not only does the US pay considerably more for its healthcare, but it gets consistently worse outcomes in any number of critical categories. And it is not just by a small amount. A small amount might be defensible. Maybe America has a bigger rural population, or more advanced medical technology, or there's cultural factors that contribute, like a sedentary lifestyle or diet. There's at least 2 big problems with those kinds of arguments. First, you should reasonably expect that higher cost would equate with higher quality. It would be one thing if we were paying higher cost, but had higher quality relative to our peers, but to be paying considerably higher cost for way worse outcomes is really indefensible. Second, we aren't even reasonably in line with other countries. The fact is, some country or another has to be the most expensive. That's a given. But we are so far outside of the cost of other countries that we look like an error in the data. Per person, healthcare spending in the US is 42% higher than Switzerland, the next most expensive country. It's 65% higher than Germany, the 3rd most expensive, more than twice as expensive as France, and almost 2.5 times the UK. What parts of the system drive that cost? Well, everything. The standard services you think of for healthcare, primary care, specialists, surgical care, hospitals, and clinics, are fully 2.5 times the cost of a selection of economically comparable countries. Prescription drugs are 58% more than the comparison set. Administrative costs are well over 4 times the others. 4 times! Remember the insane spiderweb of transactions from my example earlier? Even preventive care is 80% higher than the comps. For all of these insanely disproportional costs, you would expect the healthiest darn country on earth. We overspend drastically on preventive care, primary care, prescriptions, hospital stays, and surgery. So what do we get for it? A recent set of studies comparing key health outcomes for 11 high-income countries shows the US has the highest infant mortality rate, maternal mortality near 3 times the rate of the next worst country, the worst rate of preventable mortality, and the worst disease burden, 24% worse than the second worst. And the incriminating list goes on and on and on. Don't get me wrong, within the US there is access to excellent high-quality healthcare. We have fantastic doctors and nurses, training and facilities, equipment and medicine. We're not a 3rd world country. We simply, as a nation, do far worse than most other comparable nations and at a much higher cost. Beyond that, there are some uniquely terrible and completely unnecessary downsides to the US healthcare system. A 2007 study indicated that 70 million Americans have difficulty paying for treatment or have medical debt. That's around 1 out of every 5 men, women, and children. 60% of people with medical debt had insurance. Over 60% of all bankruptcies in the US were due to medical debt, and over 1 million adults every year declare bankruptcy due to their medical debt. The cost of care here also prevents many people from visiting doctors if they're sick, or putting off care until it becomes critical. In the US, a person suffering a heart attack has to mentally weigh the risk of being driven to the hospital versus taking an ambulance. And parents of children in the US have to worry about whether their child's treatment will bankrupt the family. For many, it's medicine or food. Frankly, many people facing prolonged treatment would rather just die and leave their family life insurance as opposed to entering the churning maw of the US healthcare system and leave themselves and their progeny financially ruined. And on the less serious but still infuriating side, how many small business ideas or creative pursuits have gone unexplored because someone needed the insurance? It wouldn't even make sense to put the US on a graph against other countries on these parameters. Medical debt and bankruptcies are virtually unheard of in other wealthy nations. And to so many people around the developed world, the fact that a mother has to even think about money when considering care for her child is positively medieval. Let's call a spade a spade. We suck. So let's return to our original two questions. Why is it so expensive, and how can we improve it? Chapter 4. Why does it cost so much? Entire careers have been devoted to tracking why it's so expensive, but I'm going to take a crack at it in just a few key points. Number 1, opacity. People don't actually know what they're paying, or how much their insurance really costs. Number 2, complexity, which we alluded to earlier with my story and we'll revisit in a little bit more detail. Number 3, history. As usual, the past has something to tell us about our current situation. And number 4, political motivation. Lots of people have stigma around healthcare, and it's reinforced by either friendly or hostile media, lobbying, and other key constituencies like insurance companies. Recently, I had a friend post the following on Facebook. Sometimes I sit on my porch and think about my $30 a month pre-Obamacare insurance. Those were the days. I don't blame this person for that view. Unless you're a real nerd like me, digging through pay stubs looking to glean advanced economic wisdom, there's a really good chance that you don't actually know how much your healthcare costs you either. I'll use myself as an example of someone who has good corporate insurance. When I do my annual selections for my health plan, it tells me how much it's going to cost me per paycheck. In my case, it's around $150 per check for my family plan. 24 benefit paying checks per year means my insurance costs around $3,600 a year, right? No. Because there's a whole hidden portion that you don't see that's paid by your company. But you can find it. Sometimes you can tease it out during your benefit sign-up if you click enough stray links. But you can always find it on your W-2, under employer-sponsored health plan or something similar. In my case, it was hidden in box 12.dd. And for 2022, the almost completely invisible amount that my employer paid for my insurance, drumroll please, $20,800. This is the same phenomenon that bit my friend, and I'm sure many others, when they were trying to wrestle with this issue. If someone were only to check their pay deductions, they could easily miss 80% or more of the true cost of their insurance. And think about this, that's money that your employer pays to employ you either way. They could pay that to you instead. More on that later. For the curious, go to healthcare.gov and look up a plan that's comparable to yours in terms of the deductible and the out-of-pocket maximum and the co-insurance rates. You'll probably find that their cost per month multiplied by 12 so that you get the total annual rate is pretty similar to what your corporate insurance is paying. End of the day, it's all pretty much the same crap. The point is pretty simple. If you have an employer-sponsored plan, you are probably paying way more than you think. And if you're a person that actually uses their healthcare, you can add the cost of the deductible to all of those premiums before your health insurance really does anything. It would be easy to think that I have a $3,600 a year plan with a $5,000 deductible for a total cost of $8,600 a year. That's, less bad for coverage against major medical catastrophes. But think of it this way, in actuality, between my direct premium payments and employer payments that could have been added to my salary, I'm paying $24,000 a year just for the privilege of having coverage. Add a $5,000 deductible before my insurance actually does anything, that's $29,000 a year for the people actually utilizing their insurance regularly. Naturally, it's different for people based on age, health, family, medical history, whatever, but it's probably a lot more than you're mentally accounting for. Be aware of your real costs. I am convinced that part of the reason it's allowed to stay so expensive is because people don't know about this enough to get mad about it. That should end for you today. So, know what it really costs and share the love. Reason number 2 for why it's so expensive is complexity. I teased this issue earlier with my personal story. Referring back to my spider web of transactions, let's add a $sign by every transaction where somebody is seeking to make a profit. My insurance company is, in fact, a company, so in order to operate and generate value for shareholders, they need a profit. Each of the individual hospitals, clinics, specialists, and whatever are also operating for profit, and each of their independent billing companies are also companies operating for profit. Conceptually, profit is a simple notion. It's the amount that customers pay you minus the amount that it costs you to service those customer requests. If you sell hamburgers for $5 and it costs you $4 to make those hamburgers, then you have profited $1 per hamburger. We can make it as simple or as complicated as you like. But look at these dollar signs and realize that each one of those dollar signs represents a financial incentive for a company to simultaneously charge you more and offer you less. Now let's learn something about how we got here. I'd like to read you an excerpt from somewhat of an expert. The quest for some form of universal healthcare in the United States dates back to 1912, when Theodore Roosevelt, who had previously served nearly 8 years as a Republican president, decided to run again, this time on a progressive ticket and with a platform that called for the establishment of a centralized national health service. At the time, few people had or felt the need for private health insurance. Most Americans paid their doctors visit by visit, but the field of medicine was quickly growing more sophisticated, and as more diagnostic tests and surgeries became available, the attendant costs began to rise, tying health more explicitly to wealth. Both the United Kingdom and Germany had addressed similar issues by instituting national health insurance systems, and other European nations would eventually follow suit. While Roosevelt ultimately lost the 1912 election, his party's progressive ideals planted a seed that accessible and affordable medical care might be viewed as a right more than a privilege. It wasn't long, however, before doctors and Southern politicians vocally opposed any type of government involvement in healthcare, branding it as a form of Bolshevism. After FDR imposed a nationwide wage freeze meant to stem inflation during World War II, many companies began offering private health insurance and pension benefits as a way to compete for the limited number of workers not deployed overseas. Once the war ended, this employer-based system continued, in no small part because labor unions liked the arrangement, since it enabled them to use the more generous benefit packages negotiated under collective bargaining agreements as a selling point to recruit new members. The downside was that it left those unions unmotivated to push for government-sponsored health programs that might help everybody else. Harry Truman proposed a national healthcare system twice, once in 1945 and again as part of his Fair Deal package in 1949, but his appeal for public support was no match for the well-financed PR efforts of the American Medical Association and other industry lobbyists. Opponents didn't just kill Truman's effort. They convinced a large swath of the public that socialized medicine would lead to rationing, the loss of your family doctor, and the freedoms Americans hold so dear. After those defeats, the strategy changed. LBJ would implement Medicare to cover the elderly and Medicaid to cover the poor as part of his Great Society legislation in 1965. Through the 1970s and 80s, it worked fine. Coverage was adequate, prices seemed reasonable, and medical technology was advancing at a very rapid rate, seemingly justifying the for-profit model to drive those innovations. But eventually, the cost caught up. All those advanced drugs, medicines, and technologies kept costing more and more, but with insurers obstructing the cost of the care from consumers, no one really noticed or cared. Meanwhile, the 20% of people not covered by an employer, Medicare, or Medicaid began en masse the all-too-familiar practice of deferring care until it was an emergency and they had no other option. To cover the unpaid bills of the uninsured, hospitals and care providers had to begin charging the insured more money. Again, that cost was obscured by the insurance providers until it really reared its ugly head. But for the insurers to continue to break even, they had to gather more in premiums. Let's read more. All this explained why the United States spent a lot more money per person on healthcare than any other advanced economy. 112% more than Canada, 109% more than France, 117% more than Japan, and for similar or worse results. The difference amounted to hundreds of billions of dollars per year, money that could have been used, instead, to provide quality childcare for American families, or to reduce college tuition, or to eliminate a good chunk of the federal deficit. Spiraling healthcare costs also burdened American businesses. Japanese and German automakers didn't have to worry about the extra $1,500 in worker and retiree healthcare costs that Detroit had to build into the price of every car rolling off the assembly line. In fact, it was in response to foreign competition that U.S. companies began offloading rising insurance costs onto their employees in the late 1980s and 90s, replacing traditional plans that had few, if any, out-of-pocket costs with cheaper versions that included higher deductibles, co-pays, lifetime limits, and other unpleasant surprises hidden in the fine print. Unions often found themselves able to preserve their traditional benefit plans only by agreeing to forego increases in wages. Small businesses found it tough to provide their workers with health benefits at all. Meanwhile, insurance companies that operated in the individual market perfected the art of rejecting customers who, according to their actuarial data, were most likely to make use of the healthcare system, especially anyone with a pre-existing condition, which they often defined to include anything from a previous bout of cancer to asthma and chronic allergies. Like or dislike the author, that's a pretty straightforward and honest reckoning of the modern history of healthcare in the US. Which leads us to Part 4, Political Motivation. How does it continue? How is a crappy system supported and reinforced? Well, our reading from Obama already mentioned it a little bit, and as Mark Twain famously maybe said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Get these quotes again. Doctors and Southern politicians vocally opposed any type of government involvement in healthcare, branding it as a form of Bolshevism. Harry Truman proposed a national healthcare system twice, but his appeal for public support was no match for the well-financed PR efforts of the American Medical Association and other industry lobbyists. Opponents didn't just kill Truman's effort, they convinced a large swath of the public that socialized medicine would lead to rationing, the loss of your family doctor, and the freedoms Americans hold so dear. Literally over 100 years of the exact same bull. In 1912, when Maximum American Teddy Roosevelt proposed a healthcare system, it was branded as a form of socialism. To be frank, clearly government-sponsored healthcare is a form of socialism, but we need to get over the idea that that is inherently a bad thing. For one, your private healthcare is already essentially socialism, except that it openly takes advantage of you in honor of profit. No, really. Take away all of the horror movie sounds, and the basic gist of a socialistic setup is that everybody pays a little bit, usually in the form of taxes, so that nobody pays a lot. But that's exactly how our precious private health insurance system already works. The basic premise of an insurance company is to take in more revenue, primarily in the form of customer premiums, than they pay out for their customers' medical needs. Like I showed earlier, I'm paying somewhere in the vicinity of $30,000 per year between my premiums, my employer's premiums, and my out-of-pocket deductible before insurance really does anything substantial. For many relatively healthy people, that's the exact same experience. So where does that money go? Theoretically, it goes toward medical expenses from other participants. Said more plainly, your premiums pay for other people's care. Well, and if expensive members like those with chronic or pre-existing conditions can be cut off and only profitable people remain, the money can also go towards like executive bonuses, a skyscraper, or another sports stadium bearing the name of the insurance company. Really good stuff. But the point is, those premiums that you pay are already covering somebody else's expenses. Swap the word premium for taxes and you have the same setup. Except in the for-profit model, the insurance company has a business incentive to simultaneously charge you more revenue and serve you less cost. A public model does not have either of those pressures. Now, if this exact same system were operated for the public interest instead of for profit, those excesses could go to any number of really exciting things. Deficit reduction, increased medical research and grants, or get this, reduced cost for all of the plan participants. Remember the title of the video? Let's go back to Obama for one more second. Unsurprisingly, insurance companies had balked at the idea of a public option, arguing that they would not be able to compete against a government insurance plan that could operate without the pressures of making a profit. Of course, for public option proponents, that was exactly the point. By highlighting the cost-effectiveness of government insurance and exposing the bloated waste and immorality of the private insurance market, they hoped the public option would pave the way for a single-payer system. In America, we have dramatically overcomplicated this issue. Certain motivated parties have done everything possible to obfuscate, confuse, mislead, and convince a large portion of the population to keep a broken system that does not have to be this way. If it worked well, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I hope that this video has helped to illustrate that the US really does pay a lot more for a lot worse health outcomes compared to other developed nations. All of those developed nations, by the way, which use government-sponsored public healthcare operated to extremely good effect. Here's where I'm going to slip a little bit outside of fact and a little bit into my personal opinion. Here's a summary of my personal belief on what I think government should do. Government should only do what the free market cannot do equitably or efficiently. But when it does do something, it should do it well. It's a simple perspective, but one that I hope has a lot of power, especially with my more conservative-leaning friends and viewers. Why? Because it starts out with the fundamental assumption that the government should not do something. One huge beauty of America is the wide open opportunity for everyone. Business, innovation, entrepreneurship, and profit are all a-okay with me. But there are things that simply do not work on the free market, and we should recognize when public governance would be a major benefit to all of our citizens. For instance, we wouldn't want military force to be a private enterprise. I'll debate any topic with anybody, but let's go ahead and take it for granted that having a consolidated and centralized military response has been, shall we say, important in developing the US as an international leader and presence. Infrastructure is another area where surely even the staunchest libertarians and conservatives can see some value in having a centralized funding source. The libertarian utopia of streets operated for profit is an absolute nightmare. It's a complex web of tolls, monopolies on routes, and various microtransactions that would inevitably lead to worse driving conditions at a higher cost. Sound familiar? We've given the private health insurance market a real, genuine college try over the last several generations of Americans. It's gotten to be progressively worse, with no signs of stopping. We pay far more than other countries for far worse health outcomes. And there are genuinely unique American issues that are absolutely horrifying. It's time that we move on to something else. And that something else very well could be copying what has clearly worked in many other countries that are very similar to us culturally and economically. It is time to relieve this incredible burden from the American people. Chapter 5. What can be done? The first step in solving any problem is admitting that there is a problem. If at the beginning of this video you thought that the US was #1 in healthcare outcomes, nothing could be further from the truth. Heck, we're not even comparable to many of our economic peers on some of these parameters. And the reasons why are not mysterious or overly complicated. Typically, I can argue an issue from all sides and present a whole lot of alternatives and maybes and options and really just complicate the outcomes. For this one, I'm gonna keep it simple. It's time for public health care. At the very minimum, a public option. I recognize it's not a panacea. Nothing is ever that simple. When we use the word efficiency in terms of any job or any industry, it typically results in some job losses. There will absolutely be some people in medical billing or in insurance who have jobs that will not necessarily be replaced by a public option. Some of those jobs will be replaced directly by the increase in public funding and having to manage the public option. But certainly, there would probably be a net reduction of jobs in that specific sector. We also need to think about what I mentioned earlier very briefly. Innovation, job mobility, and startups could skyrocket without the pressure to have insurance and stay married to a large corporation that provides it. This is a major advantage to everybody within the US economy. And there are lots of different models from around the world to gather inspiration from. Germany uses a blended public-private model not too dissimilar to ours, but with a strengthened public sector to help cover the unemployed, the poor, and the elderly. Small contributions from employers and workers help to offset the costs and provide quality care for everyone, providing good care for 60% of what the average American pays for their care, while avoiding catastrophic medical bills. The UK, France, and Japan all made moves in the decades after the war to put in place some sort of universal coverage. Specific details vary from place to place, but they all essentially provide high-quality, universal coverage with some form of tax and corporate contribution. Maybe the lowest hanging fruit in terms of comparison countries is Switzerland. Their health plan was established very recently in 1994, and it offers less direct government intervention than some of the other countries we've talked about. They use a mandatory health insurance system where you have to buy insurance from a private company, but the plans that those companies offer are heavily regulated so that prices and access are controlled. Consistently across the globe, we see that broader access leads to less last-minute emergency care, which tends to be very expensive, and more leverage in negotiating and controlling prices. Regulatory intervention can also help to quell inefficiencies and price gouging by forcing transparency. The point is, there are many different options for us to improve on our current healthcare delivery system in the States. The Affordable Care Act, colloquially known as Obamacare, made moves in this direction. Since its implementation, half of Congress has been trying to either starve it or kill it, with no real proposals for an alternative improvement scheme. I liken it to saying a brand new car with an empty gas tank and one flat tire is worthy of scrap and needs to be in the junk heap. Maybe instead of throwing it away, we need to fix the tire and fill it up with gas, and we can get an efficient system with barely any change to what we have now. A quote famously attributed to Winston Churchill sums it up pretty well. The Americans will always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. There's one more thing that I want to talk about that's really important before I close. Whenever this conversation comes up, somebody inevitably comes up with the line, well, you'll just pay more in taxes and be worse off than you are now. This tired old line is brought to you by the same people who think that if you get a raise, it might bump you into a higher income tax bracket and result in a net loss. In other words, people that we should politely but firmly tell to never speak on financial matters again. Let's illustrate this using a similar set of assumptions and parameters as we did in a previous video, Where Does My Paycheck Go? What we're going to do here is your paycheck before and after, with one side representing the private health insurance model and one representing a theoretical pro forma public model. And we're going to step through some scenarios here. In scenario 1, I'm just going to show you how replacing the health insurance costs with taxes would shift the overall balance of your paycheck. Let's assume that you would keep the exact same amount take home, you would pay the same amount in retirement, and you would pay the same amount for elective benefits, extra stuff like life insurance that wouldn't be covered by your normal healthcare. Now, here's where we get some separation. Clearly, on a public option, you would expect higher taxes, but what you would not have to pay for versus your private model is health insurance and your employer contributions to your healthcare. What you see here is a shift from 3 sources contributing into 1 source. But there's 2 big assumptions here that we really need to talk about. Number 1, that the amount your company currently pays towards your insurance premiums would be added to your salary. Now, this is not a given, but I do think that it's a very easy thing for a competent legislator to write into a public healthcare conversion bill. The tax and incentive structure towards companies could easily be written so that the company is neutral and we're not costing our employers more money than we would be on today's setup. And number 2, and this is something that will benefit the public option as we see, we're assuming that all of our insurance cost rolls into taxes. But the whole premise of this video is that the private health insurance setup itself drives higher costs. So let's make some comparisons if our public healthcare option improves those costs to be in line with other economic peers. The 2 columns to the left on this chart are the ones that we just looked at, which sort of serve as a baseline for what the conversion from private to public healthcare might look like. And it sets us an upper bound for how much taxes we can pay before we start costing ourselves more than the private system. And it's pretty wide. We can pay 2.5 times more in taxes and we still have the same net take-home pay as we did on our private insurance setup. Now, what if we assume very reasonably that the public healthcare option in America would reduce the overall costs? In the 3rd column here, what I've done is I've said, what if we only close half of the cost gap to the 2nd worst country in terms of overall healthcare expenditures? Well, that would be a $4,000 annual reduction in the amount that you pay via taxation in this case to your healthcare amount. That would theoretically let you take $4,000 more home per paycheck. So when those politicians that you don't like talk about how a public option is not going to cost you more on your paycheck, this is exactly what they mean. But it gets even better because there's more that you can do with that $4,000 a year than just take it home. You could also, for instance, maintain the same contribution rate to your retirement. And now, not only are you taking $3,000 more home per year, but you're also contributing another $1,000 towards your retirement, or whatever you want to do with that distribution. Now, I'm going to show one final situation. In this situation, rather than only closing half of the gap to the 2nd worst country in terms of cost for healthcare, what if we got all the way down to the average of our economic peers? In this case, you could simultaneously contribute $1,600 more per year to your retirement, maintaining your same contribution rate of 8% as before, and take home up to $10,000 extra on your paycheck after taxes on a $100,000 assumed salary. This is not small change we're talking about. We are talking about better and less stressful healthcare for a dramatically lower cost and more money in your pocket. And there may be some stadiums that no longer bear the name of insurance companies, but I think that's a sacrifice that most of us are willing to make. If you are still with me, thank you so much for watching this all the way through to the end. This has been a huge labor of love for me. It's been fun and frustrating to dig into these details, and I hope that it's been positive and educational for you. If you want more content like this and you want to help the channel out and help get the word out, then there's some things that you can do for absolutely free. You can like, subscribe, comment, or share this video, have some conversations with friends, let them know that this was a good video for you, and let them know that it was worth the watch. If you want to support me directly, you can also subscribe to my Patreon, which is linked below, or can be done by typing www.patreon.com/TravisLane. And finally, there is something cool that I have for sale this time. Every year when my benefit elections come up at my company, I've created, you guessed it, a spreadsheet to analyze the different plans depending on your costs and your expected healthcare expenditures. I am 100% confident that this Excel file that I'm gonna share with you today has saved many people thousands of dollars. It can be yours today for only $3, and I'll teach you how to use it if you go and click the link below. Once again, everybody, thank you for watching. This has been Travis Lane, making important things make sense. And boop. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. Please, make yourself comfortable while I read you a passage. According to the actuarial data, blah, 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 blah. This is what I do when I'm up there alone, by the way. I make pooty noises in between takes.